I have kept the minutes of a great many proceedings in my 12 years as secretary to the Household Administrative Panel, and I have never once been tempted to describe any of them as remarkable. Fitness reviews, budget inquiries, protocol disputes between departments that have been feuding since before I was born. They come and go, and I record them faithfully and think nothing more about them. I still think about the one on the 14th of October. Committee Room 4 is at the far end of the annex's eastern corridor. Oak panels, 3 sash windows that stick in cold weather, a long table that seats 9 with 8 chairs already arranged. I arrived early, as I always do, and I was setting out the water glasses when I heard the sound of boots on the flagstone outside. Not a group, one set, measured, evenly spaced, unhurried. I looked up, and there was the guardsman, Corporal Calloway, standing in parade rest 2 paces from the door with his back to the corridor wall and his eyes straight ahead. I had been told to expect him at 9. It was 8:30. I stepped into the doorway and told him he was welcome to sit in the antechamber. He thanked me, politely, without moving. I went back to setting the glasses. He was still in exactly the same position when the first panel members arrived 20 minutes later. The terms of the review, as I understood them, were straightforward. A joint protocol assessment, requested by a foreign security delegation, examining the Aldenmere ceremonial post positions in light of a proposed new security sharing arrangement. The paperwork described it as a routine capacity evaluation. I had processed 3 of these in the last 4 years. They were, without exception, dull. Colonel Drevick arrived at 8:56, with 2 aides and a leather portfolio he never once opened. He was a compact man, somewhere in his late 50s, with the manner of someone who has given a great many orders in rooms full of people who were careful to agree with him. He chose the chair directly across from the presiding position, without asking, and sat before anyone else had done so. One of his aides placed a single sheet of paper in front of him. He glanced at it once, then looked around the room, as though appraising its dimensions and finding them adequate. Commander Vessa, who was presiding, arrived at 8:58. She took her seat at the head of the table without comment. The 2 palace household representatives settled on her left. I opened my notebook. At 9 o'clock I went to the door and asked Corporal Calloway to come in. He was 34 years old, according to his file. 13 years at the Aldenmere post. He stood in the open doorway for 1 second, then crossed to the single chair that had been placed across from the panel, and sat. He wore his ceremonial uniform, the red tunic, the white gloves, the medals in their correct order on the left breast. His back did not touch the chair's backrest. His hands rested on his knees. He was looking at a point somewhere on the wall above Commander Vessa's head, and his expression told you nothing at all. Colonel Drevick studied him for a moment, the way a man studies a piece of furniture he is deciding whether to reupholster or replace. Commander Vessa opened the review. She summarized the purpose, the joint assessment, the protocol proposal, the post under consideration. She asked Corporal Calloway to confirm his name and length of service. Corporal Wren Calloway, 13 years, 2 months. Colonel Drevick wrote something on his sheet of paper. The standard questions followed: post hours, training currency, physical assessment scores, annual evaluations. The corporal answered each one, not tersely, exactly, but with precision. 5 words where 5 words were sufficient. 7 where 7 were required, nothing more. I was typing as fast as I could, and still I finished each of his answers before he had fully delivered them, because they contained nothing extraneous. I noticed, during those first 10 minutes, that he did not watch the colonel. He tracked whoever was speaking to him, answered them, and returned his gaze to that point above the commander's head. It was not rudeness. It was something more deliberate than that. The bearing of a man who has been in rooms with louder men than Colonel Drevick, and has learned not to give them the satisfaction of his attention. Colonel Drevick waited through the first 10 minutes with the patience of a man who has already decided the answer, and is simply allowing the process to complete itself. Then he set his pen down. "With respect to Commander Vessa," he said, and he said it in the tone of a man who means the words as decoration rather than courtesy, "I find I must speak to the substantive concern. The position under review is, in my assessment, wholly ceremonial in nature. Ornamental, one might say. The post exists for the purposes of tradition and public image, not operational security. I have reviewed the attached figures. The guardsman's formal threat response training was last certified. He glanced at his sheet. 4 years ago. His operational deployment record shows no field service in the last 8 years. I raised the question, respectfully, of whether this position, in its current form, serves the joint protocol in any functional capacity whatsoever, or whether it might more productively be reallocated. The two household representatives exchanged a look. Commander Vessa made a note. I looked at Corporal Calloway. He had not moved. His eyes were on the same point above the commander's head. His hands had not shifted on his knees. His breathing, as far as I could tell, was the same as it had been when he walked through the door. Corporal Calloway, Commander Vessa said, is there anything you wish to say in response to the Colonel's summary? No, ma'am. Colonel Drevick looked briefly satisfied. I would ask, the Colonel continued, whether the Corporal can speak to his operational readiness, specifically his threat assessment capability and his close protection qualifications. I hold the standard post certifications, Corporal Calloway said. Current to 4 years ago. That is correct. And prior to your current assignment, your last active field posting was, I am not at liberty to discuss prior postings. That brought a pause. Colonel Drevick's chin came up slightly. I beg your pardon? I am not at liberty to discuss prior postings. The Colonel turned to Commander Vessa. I find it difficult to complete a capacity assessment when the subject declines to provide relevant history. Commander Vessa looked at Corporal Calloway. Corporal, is there a specific basis for that restriction? Yes, ma'am. Can you state that basis? No, ma'am. Another silence. I kept typing, because I did not know what else to do. Then, Colonel Drevick said, his voice sharpening, I must request that the full service record be produced. Commander, I believe you have the file. Commander Vessa had the file. I had watched her carry it in under her arm. It was a standard cream folder, the kind I see 50 of a year, except that the top right corner bore a classification marking I had seen once before in my career and had never expected to see again. A vertical stripe of dark red, with a 2-letter code above it that I did not know the meaning of and had not sought to learn. Commander Vessa looked at the folder for a moment before she opened it. She read for perhaps 90 seconds. I could see her eyes moving, slowly, and then stopping, and then moving back to the top of a page and moving again. The room was very quiet. One of the Colonel's aides shifted in his chair. The other aide was watching the commander's face. The second aide's name was Lieutenant Colonel Heron. He was the Colonel's deputy. He had said nothing since entering the room. Commander Vessa turned to the second page. She read. She turned to the third page and stopped at the top third of it. She set the page flat on the table with both hands, the way you set something down when you have decided it deserves care, and she looked up. I am going to read one section of this record into the minutes, she said, for the purposes of this review. She read it aloud. It was a single paragraph, 4 sentences. I transcribed every word. I will not reproduce it here, but I will tell you what it described, because I have thought about it on most days since. It described a period of operational service in a foreign mountain range, during a joint action that had no official name and whose participating units were not identified in the passage. It described a guardsman, no name, only a service designation, who had, across an 11-day period in that range, performed a function that I do not have the vocabulary to properly characterize. It described the conditions. It described what was achieved. And at the end, it noted that the individual's record had been sealed by order of the household's senior operational authority, at the individual's own request, because the individual had asked, upon returning, to be given a ceremonial post. That was the word used. Asked. When Commander Vessa finished reading, she closed the folder and set it to one side. Lieutenant Colonel Heron, the Colonel's deputy, had been very still through all of it. He was still now. Then he put both hands flat on the table and pushed his chair back and stood. Commander, he said, I request that this session be closed. Colonel Drevick turned to look at his deputy. Something passed between them. Not words, not a gesture, just a shift in the air of the room. The Colonel's position paper, one of the aides began. The Colonel's position paper, Lieutenant Colonel Heron said, with a precision that cut the aide off cleanly, is no longer operative. He did not look at Corporal Calloway when he said it. He looked at the commander. Commander Vesa held the lieutenant colonel's gaze for a moment. Then she closed her own notebook and nodded once. The session was formally closed at 9:47 in the morning. The total elapsed time from the colonel's first substantive remark to the closing was 22 minutes. One of the household representatives said something brief and quiet to Commander Vesa on their way out. I did not catch it. Colonel Drevik left without speaking to anyone. Lieutenant Colonel Heron paused at the door and looked back into the room. He was not looking at me. I am not certain he was looking at anything, exactly. Then he left. A palace orderly came to escort Corporal Calloway back to his post. The corporal stood, straightened, though there was not much to straighten, and crossed the room. At the door he paused, and he turned back toward me, because I was still at the table gathering my papers. "Thank you," he said, "for the water." I had not thought to put water on the single chair's side of the table. He had been sitting without it for the duration. I do not know whether he meant it as a genuine courtesy for the water that had been there before the room was rearranged for a formal hearing, or simply as a polite acknowledgement of my presence. Either way, he said it, and then he walked out, and I heard his footsteps on the flagstone receding down the corridor. The same measured pace, the same even spacing, the same unhurried cadence as when he had arrived. I stayed in the room for a while after the orderly had gone. I gathered the folders, the pen caps, the unused notepads. I straightened the chairs that had been pushed back. I collected the single sheet of paper the colonel had left on the table and filed it with the other session materials. Then I stood at the window for a moment and looked down into the southern courtyard, where you can see, at a certain angle, the far edge of the palace's main gate. He was there, back at his post, bearskin straight, white gloves at his sides, rifle at the carry. He was not moving. I closed my notebook and walked back down the corridor. I have kept the minutes of a great many proceedings. I write them up, file them, and move on. That is the nature of the work. I have read and reread the minutes from the 14th of October more times than I can count. He asked to be given the post. That is what the file said. He came back from a place with no official name, after 11 days in a mountain range that the record does not identify, having done something the record describes but does not celebrate. And he asked for the gait, the red tunic, the bearskin, the silence. He asked to stand still. He asked for the work of holding. I do not know what he saw in those 11 days. I do not think it is any of my business to know. What I know is that a man who has earned the right to be anywhere he chooses is standing at a gate in the cold, every morning, because he chose to be there. The hearing that was meant to remove him lasted 22 minutes. He was there before it started, and he was there when it ended, and as far as I know, he is there still. Some men make their strength loudly. Some men hold it so still that you do not understand what you are looking at until someone opens a folder in a quiet room and reads 4 sentences aloud, and the man across the table who has spent 40 minutes trying to diminish him has to be quietly corrected by his own deputy. Corporal Calloway asked for a gait and a silence. That is what he chose, out of everything he could have chosen. That is what discipline looks like when it has nothing left to prove.